Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the first grand rounds of the new year. I hope you all had a wonderful winter break. We're very excited about today's grand round. I think, as you all know, it's pretty hard to open up a newspaper or your web browser without being confronted with the questions surrounding the economics of healthcare. Now, of course, our job as healthcare providers is always to do the very best for our patients, but it's no longer possible to do that with the blissful ignorance to costs that, frankly, I enjoyed during my early years. One of the parts of the Children's National culture that I really appreciate and respect is the transparency and deep partnership between the hospital administration and the bedside caregivers. And it is in that spirit and through many discussions on the topic of the cost of healthcare decisions that we asked our own Stephanie Todd from the Division of Hospitalist Pediatrics to present today's grand round. Now, born and raised in the great Midwest state of Wisconsin, Stephanie completed her undergraduate and medical school training at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, so you know she's tough. Did her residency at Vanderbilt Children's Hospital, and she entered the ranks of hospital medicine after 4 years at Children's Hospital Colorado in Denver. Like many others in this audience, myself included, she found her way to Children's National in part because of our sterling reputation, of course, but she tells me that the gravitational pull of defense contracting for her military husband may have played a role as well. Stephanie's a born questioner, one of the greatest assets to any academic health center, and frankly to many of the discussion groups and innovation and growth groups that I've attended. Her career in hospital medicine has gained momentum around value-based care, and she's currently being mentored by some of the leaders in this field. She's currently working on several projects to drive value in the inpatient setting, particularly around biases in publications and the validity of evidence we hold as truth, as well as our initiatives to reduce overuse in general. She's part of the Healthcare Value Special Interest Group and part of the Physicians Advisory Group here at Children's National for the Non-Labor Cost Reduction Steering Committee. So with no further ado, I'll let Stephanie get her grand rounds. I hope you're first.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Steinhorn. So we're going to have some live audience participation. For those of you who are not fearful of technology, probably the one on the left is a little bit easier, and that's to log in to pollev.com/motoline and watch for autocorrections as you type that. The greatest threat to America's fiscal health is not Social Security. It's not the investments that we've made to rescue our economy during this crisis. By a wide margin, the biggest threat to our nation's balance sheet is the skyrocketing cost of healthcare. It's not even close. Today's discussion is on value-based care. We're going to discuss ways to add value and eliminate waste. But first, to understand value-driven care, we need to understand the value equation. Simply put, value is outcomes divided by cost, such that if we can increase outcomes or improve our outcomes and do it with less cost, we'll drive value. The goals of this presentation are simply to raise awareness, to provide transparency, and to discuss alternatives. With that, let's take a quiz. So here's where you can get out your pollev.com/motoline and be prepared. So our first question is, the U.S. currently spends what % of GDP on healthcare? All right, I think we're still moving. I like it, 9%, optimistic. And wrong, we'll get there. Okay, next question, true or false? Physician/clinical services and hospital care account for greater than 50% of U.S. healthcare dollars? Don't be swayed by A. I mean, seems to be a popular choice. All right. Question 3, waste or unnecessary care accounts for what percentage of healthcare spending? At Children's National, I am confident about what the hospital charges for various labs, tests, and medications. I mean, maybe.
Somebody knows.
Who's A? Wow. And finally, at Children's National, IV acetaminophen is blank times more expensive than PO or PR acetaminophen. Do we have any surgeons in the audience ordering this medication? Just I do too, at the hospital. All right, let's see how you guys are doing. All right, we're going to answer these questions, so have no fear. You'll know how you did on your test results shortly. So let's go back to this quote. Following the 2008 global financial crisis, President Obama identified healthcare spending as the single greatest threat to our financial health as a nation. How is that possible? Out of all the areas where our government spends money, how can healthcare spending be the greatest risk to our budget? As physicians, do we know what it costs to care for our patients? Do we understand the bigger picture of the economic impact on our country when we care for our patients? How about here at Children's National? Do we know what's happening within these walls on a smaller scale? Let's take a look at what Barack Obama was referring to on a global scale. This graph demonstrates total health spending across 11 countries with advanced economies. As you can see, the U.S. is well behind its peers in total health spending per capita, spending more than twice the average of other OECD countries. We are spending about $9,500 per person when our European friends like Germany and France are spending way less. So what does $9,500 per person add up to? Well, the answer is $3 trillion. And the trending doesn't look promising. So the answer to our Poll Everywhere question, how much does the U.S. currently spend on GDP? The answer is 18% for healthcare. So what does $3 trillion buy us? Better health outcomes or longer lives? Turns out not so much. $3 trillion doesn't buy us better health. Here's an example of infant mortality, but I could have easily replaced this slide with one reflecting low birth weight infants, childhood obesity, teen pregnancy, life expectancy, and myriad other adult conditions including diabetes, heart disease, and disability to name a few, and the U.S. would still fare the same, remaining near the bottom when compared to other countries with vigorous economies. Furthermore, racial and economic disparities do not explain this difference. Americans who are white, insured, college-educated, and upper income still have poorer health than their counterparts in other industrialized countries. And what's worse, we are mentally stuck in the American mentality that more is better, largely unaware of the law of diminishing returns. This is a basic economic principle that simply states that there is a point after which the benefits gained are less than the amount of money spent. Said differently, there's a tipping point where the more money you spend, the less you get. Costs go up exponentially, as do harms. So we aren't getting more value for our dollar. And in some cases, the more we spend, the worse the outcome. So where is all that money going if it's not making us healthier? As a biased doctor, I prefer to blame insurance companies, inefficient bureaucracy, big pharma, possibly lawyers, for the excessive costs associated with healthcare. Those are parts of the industry that I can't touch physically as a physician. However, when studying the National Health Expenditure for 2014, I was amazed that I am impacting actually greater than 50% of healthcare spending, specifically the 20% of physician and clinical services, and the 32% of delivering hospital care. So the answer to our poll everywhere question was true. This was mind-blowing to me. To think that as a physician I am part of the larger problem doesn't sit well. There is overutilization here. We are racking up charges and spending more with extra tests, services, and procedures that are not doing us any better. We are simply spending too much, and there's a whole lot of waste in what we are doing. In fact, it is estimated that 30%, 1/3, of all our spending is wasted on services that do not improve health outcomes. In 2010, the Institute of Medicine, now known as the National Academy of Medicine, published 2 landmark studies that highlighted the waste and inefficiency in healthcare. In 2010, that totaled $765 billion of waste per year. That number is now more than $780 billion and still growing. The report listed 6 buckets of waste that you can see here around the pie chart. Higher prices, administrative expenses and fraud accounted for almost half of this waste, but bigger than any of those categories was unnecessary services here at $210 billion. So what does $780 billion of waste actually mean? Well, to put it in perspective, $780 billion annually of waste is more than our entire K-12 budget for education. It's more than the entire Department of Defense budget for 2017, which was $583 billion. And it's 288 times more than the entire budget that the Department of Energy allotted for research into alternative energy resources. Left unchanged, healthcare will continue to underperform, cause unnecessary harm, and strain national and state budgets. Not to mention, families are going to go broke because of the medical costs that they can't afford. I'd like to turn now and focus on this largest category of waste in healthcare, the unnecessary services, at more than $210 billion. A catchphrase in medicine that is used to describe some of the contributors of waste in this category is overuse. Sorry. Overuse occurs when a patient is hospitalized unnecessarily, receives a test, treatment, drug, or procedure that is either unnecessary, ineffective, or unwanted, and it includes overtreatment and overdiagnosis. Unnecessary means that a particular patient is very unlikely to benefit from the treatment because they either don't have the disease that you intended to treat or don't have the symptoms that you intended to use a medication for, or because the possible harms outweigh the benefits associated with that treatment. Ineffective means that the treatment is no better than placebo. And unwanted means that the patient, if they had been fully informed, would have chosen an alternative treatment or plan altogether. Perhaps you've participated in overuse when caring for an infant with bronchiolitis. Or maybe you've participated in wasteful spending by overtesting and overtreating viral illnesses or using antibiotics inappropriately. Or perhaps you wanted to prevent future physical harm by drawing all the blood at once. And I could go on. These are just a few examples of my everyday life as a hospitalist, and I'm sure you can think of examples in your own specialties as well. There are many drivers of overuse, so many that I could do a grand rounds on this alone, but they include erroneous belief systems, thoughts like, my doctor is awesome because they're very thorough. Or the culture of medicine, which trains us to believe that more is better. that errors of omission, such as not doing something that I ought to have, like not prescribing an antibiotic for an infection that warranted treatment, are more serious than errors of commission, such as prescribing that antibiotic unnecessarily that resulted in harm. As physicians, we are more concerned with doing too little rather than doing too much. We can all recall stories of the test or procedure or scan that we could have done earlier that would have clinched the diagnosis but didn't. Yet how often do you remember the examples of unnecessary tests that we've ordered? The discomfort with uncertainty is another driver of overuse. It's difficult to do nothing with information that's staring at us in the face, or more importantly, the actual patient staring at us in the face. Resolving the uncertainty of non-normal test results can lead to more testing and procedures that have costs on their own. Defensive medicine has been touted as another driver of overuse, but studies have shown that even with statutes of limitation in place, we are still spending, testing, prescribing, doing too much. A lack of medical education in areas such as shared decision-making, like what does the family actually want, or poor understanding of evidence-based medicine affects our treatment choices. An example of that is the RIVER study that was published in the New England Journal of Medicine that recommended a practice change. They recommended that children with vesicoureteral reflux should receive antimicrobial prophylaxis to prevent future UTIs. So the relative risk of developing a UTI if using antimicrobials was 50%. Okay, that sounds good when worded that way. But when you convert that benefit into number needed to treat, it means you need to treat 9 children with 2 years of antibiotics to prevent 1 UTI. That's 6,000 doses of antibiotics to prevent 1 UTI. And as far as I know, we don't have any current literature that shows that actually preventing those UTIs is protective to kidney function in the long run. So when recommending a practice change without actually assessing other variables like number needed to treat or number needed to harm, changing a practice pattern like that is just irresponsible. It's just plain dangerous. There's also a tendency towards publishing results that have that are positive. So an example of that is TAMIFLU. It's recommended by the CDC, IDSA, and AAP, and it's stockpiled by the U.S. as a Congress mandate beginning in 2013 to the tune of over $1 billion a year to stockpile this medication. And here's just a little brief review of the history of publications associated with TAMIFLU. In 2012, Cochrane did a review, and it said that there was a small positive effect, meaning that it does shorten the duration of symptoms a smidge and also prevents complications like future hospitalization. But they made a side note that the authors were unable to obtain a full set of clinical study reports from the drug manufacturer, despite many requests. By 2013, a meta-analysis had now included 8 unpublished studies, and they said, just kidding, there's actually no difference. TAMIFLU doesn't actually prevent complications, nor does it actually ease symptoms. And in 2014, Cochrane got a hold of all of those full studies that were finally released, and they said, yes, that's true. There is insufficient evidence to support the use of TAMIFLU, and in fact, they highlighted that there's adverse events, harms, including nausea, vomiting, psychiatric events, and possible renal complications associated with this medication. There's pressure from advocacy groups and advertisement. Here's an example that's on Facebook to moms groups. That smile from Kelly is a winner. And there's misperceived pressure from parents because of advertisements like this. Parents coming in potentially thinking that they want something for their child, when in the reality, if you had shared decision-making or informed them better, they wouldn't necessarily want it. There's also shielding of patients to the actual costs associated with healthcare spending because of third-party payment models. And simply put, we are actually incentivized to do more, not less. So how do we know that overuse is alive and well? Well, on the first few slides, I discussed the spending patterns of the U.S. compared to our compared to other developed countries. And I showed that we aren't healthier for it, yet we continue to spend more money. But overuse is also evidenced by practice variability. This is a great example of practice variability across the country for the #1 cause of hospitalization in infants, bronchiolitis. Direct costs associated with hospitalization for bronchiolitis total more than $543 million annually. Here's a results table from a multi-site study in which Children's National was one of the sites. As you can see, even after adjusting for demographic and clinical factors to include severity of illness, there's huge variation between hospitals with respect to the use of bronchodilators. The x-axis represents the percent of children receiving treatment, a bronchodilator, and the y-axis represents hospital sites. So an infant presenting at this hospital had a 91% chance of receiving a bronchodilator compared to this hospital site, which just had a 19% chance. This is incredible variability for a medication we know works only about 10% of the time in bronchiolitis. We also know that bronchodilators don't change outcomes like need for hospitalization, decreased length of stay, or prevent transfer to a higher level of care. And what's worse, there are harms associated with bronchodilator use like tachycardia, VQ mismatch, increased oxygen consumption and demand, which can last more than 3 hours, that lead to that hypoxemia, resulting in hospitalization that was all really iatrogenic. For this study, Children's Hospital was Site L, and we were performed in the bottom third of all hospital sites involved in this study. So what other evidence do we have to support overuse? Well, it occurs by a regular lack of adherence to guidelines. As physicians, we know that guidelines are recommendations and that those recommendations are not absolute. However, if we consider them simply suggestions and don't strive to achieve some sort of recognizable standard of care, then we're never going to decrease variability, decrease costs, decrease harms, or add value to the system as a whole. Here's a good example of how adherence to guidelines can decrease utilization. Sticking with the theme of bronchiolitis, this study involved 21 community hospitals and was pretty simple. It involved monthly QI or monthly or QI. It was a QI project involving monthly educational webinars. And after the educational seminars, you can see that bronchodilator use decreased by 29%, total number of doses by 45%, steroid use by 68%, total number of steroid doses by 35%, and chest X-ray use by 44%. And importantly, there was no change in readmission rates despite the decreased utilization. And finally, how do we know that overuse is alive and well? Well, simply put, research tells us so. I have a lot more literature, residents, I can send you that show us that the main determinant of hospitalization is pulse oximeters, and that they increase our length of stay, and that intermittent monitoring is safe, yet we continue to over-rely on pulse oximetry. And that bronchodilators have no impact on outcomes, like I just mentioned, yet we continue to use them way too much. So how are we doing with bronchiolitis 50 years later? I'll let you read this slide. So in 1965, Drs. Wright and Beam identified that bronchiolitis was self-limited, that it has a good prognosis, that the principle of first do no harm should really be the forethought of how we prevent or how we treat these patients, that we really shouldn't feel like we need to do something to make them better, that really just allowing them to rest should be treasured. So it sounds like supportive care is really the standard of treatment in 1965, and that's really the same place that we're at now. So how do we assess a hospital system's ability to provide higher value care? Large volume data about how our hospital or even a single physician is largely unavailable. These sorts of national dashboards are just not accessible. In this way, I'd like to highlight work done by my colleague here at Children's National, Dr. Kavitha Parikh, in which she set out to determine benchmarks for optimal performance in order to guide quality improvement across 3 different diagnoses: asthma, bronchiolitis, and pneumonia. And being from Children's National, our hospital was included in her results. The goal of her project was to evaluate top-performing children's hospitals in various metrics, and based off of national guidelines, determine how often Hospital X was actually meeting those goals of care. So I'd like to orient you to this heat map. Each column represents a single hospital site, and for this study there were 42 hospital sites included, and each row represents a benchmark of care for asthma, bronchiolitis, and pneumonia. The report card for the benchmark is based on color, where red is bad and dark green is good. And hospital sites are ranked in overall performance from left to right, with the poor performing hospitals, just kidding, getting used to this pointer still. Poor performing hospitals are on the left, and better performing hospitals are on the far right. So for this study, Children's National is here, and we actually are doing pretty well. But we can see that there are 3 different areas for opportunities for improvement, including decreasing viral testing for bronchiolitis, which we know is not necessary, decreasing the use of CBCs and pneumonia, which don't guide our clinical management, and we should be beginning initial narrow-spectrum antibiotics at the outset for pneumonia. So we've talked about unnecessary services through hospital care, and how there are areas for improvement by decreasing variability, adhering to the guidelines, and vigilantly assessing and reassessing and probably questioning the literature we read. And we now know that we can assess how we're doing through benchmarking. So I'd like to shift now and discuss how Children's National is working to add value within our system. With that said, let's talk about Transformation 2018. Transformation 2018 is a 5-year strategic plan that was launched in 2013. And it includes initiatives focused on driving value. The first purpose was to find areas that could be immediately improved upon, and the second purpose was to use data to drive higher value care also outside these walls in the population itself. The benchmarking study that I just explained is an example of this, where our organization can use data, comparing our performance to benchmarks with the goal of helping our institution improve. For Transformation 2018, there are 3 key areas of focus, spanning operational improvements, the Bear Institute, and lean processes, which all ultimately affect the value of the care delivered. Most of our work as physicians lies within the STARD category of clinical and operational effectiveness. There are a few examples of different diagnoses which were targeted. Some were high-volume diagnoses like asthma, but others were targeted because of the high costs associated with prolonged or inefficiently delivered care, or they were selected in order to prevent readmission rates. Based on these initiatives, financial improvements have totaled more than $217 million to date. So we reviewed that we are spending way too much on healthcare and not actually getting better results for the amount we're spending, that our country is wasting valuable resources that could be better appropriated to other social determinants of health. And we've discussed that the biggest category associated with waste is overuse. We've discussed some key drivers of overuse. We've discussed ways to decrease overuse through decreased variability, better adherence to guidelines, and paying better attention to the literature. And we've just discussed a major project of Children's National targeting increased value. I'd now like to talk about rising costs associated for caring for children in our health system. There's Transformation 2018, and it actually targeted a few of the other buckets as well. And now we're going to focus on prices that are too high. The overall inflation rate is about 0 to 2%, yet the inflation rate for drugs is up 2.5% per year. The growth in drug pricing outstrips any other area of growth in medical costs. But when you examine reasons beyond the inflated prices, you can see that research and development of new drugs doesn't explain these price hikes, because only about 10 to 20% of total spending is actually on research and development. Given that Big Pharma spends more money lobbying politicians than any other industry to the tune of $231 million annually, and PS insurance companies come in at number 2. It should come as no surprise that pricing isn't regulated. To add to the complexity, many generic drugs are now down to just one manufacturer, so we've lost the free market for drug manufacturing. This is an example of some of the price hikes that are evident when a drug is acquired by a new company. And I'll highlight the first 3 drugs on this slide: nitroprusside, IV Tylenol, or acetaminophen, and isoproterenol. When Valiant Pharmaceuticals acquired these drugs on the same day of acquisition, the drug prices increased, in this case by over 500%, and in this case by over 200% on the same day of acquisition. There was nothing different about the drugs. There was no new testing or redesign, and in fact, they weren't even manufactured in a new or different plant. The only thing that changed was the drug company's ownership. Here at Children's National, we are not immune to these price hikes. You can see that there was a 16.5% increase in drug expense between 2014 and 2016. And when you know that our total pharmacy budget is $25 million, we can isolate 10 drugs, accounting for 34% of our total budget. Those 10 drugs are listed here, some of which are used mostly as outpatient, but I'll highlight again these same 3 drugs that we just talked about in the price hike slide: isoproterenol, IV acetaminophen, and nitroprusside, because we'll focus on those next. So there's been several initiatives that our pharmacy department has undergone, things like replacing IV nitroprusside with a much cheaper but therapeutic equivalent nicardipine at an estimated cost savings of $100,000. Unfortunately, there is no drug substitute for isoproterenol, so the recommendation is to waste less, to not open the vial unless you know that use is certain. And to remedy that, there's been changes in the accessibility of this drug throughout the hospital. And for IV acetaminophen, the recommendation is to simply substitute tablets or suppositories or oral suspensions to the tune of about $155,000 in cost savings if we were simply to decrease the amount of IV Tylenol that we're ordering by 50%. That's not even including all the changes to oral or rectal routes. Let's look back at Tylenol so we can answer our pull everywhere question. At Children's National, IV acetaminophen is about 50 times more expensive than PO and PR acetaminophen. These are some of the, the pharmacy department also evaluated our Tylenol use overall and found that 65% of the orders did not fall into Children's National approved guidelines. I'm not going to read this slide. I just want you to know that guidelines exist. I didn't even know that there was guidelines about how we can order this as a physician myself, but it's available. And like I had already mentioned, if we were to simply cut the amount of IV Tylenol we're using by 50%, we'd save over $155,000. So these are some of the initiatives that the pharmacy department has started to improve value. They've added clinical decision support, meaning a pharmacist is available to suggest therapeutic alternatives. They've also, like I talked about for isoproterenol, changed the availability or access to expensive drugs. They're considering things like pop-up warnings at the site of use to include at the Pyxis when you're going to draw a medication out, or when ordering in the EMR, high-cost medication text alerts. They have pharmacists rounding with teams to suggest less expensive alternatives or earlier transition to oral equivalents if possible. And they are evaluating many other medications for cost savings. I just mentioned 3 for simplicity in this talk. So I wanted to end with a final example of where our ordering practices are directly impacting the bottom line here at Children's National. A big savings may be realized by asking ourselves if that genetic test is actually necessary. We know that genetic tests are often not resulted for 12 to 16 weeks and are very expensive. Now, for some patients with prolonged hospitalizations, getting that testing ordered or started is probably indicated. But for other patients with shorter hospitalizations, perhaps saving that testing for the outpatient setting would be more appropriate. That's because often insurance companies don't reimburse us for the total cost spent on that testing if it was done as an inpatient when it could have been done as an outpatient. Another area for improvement is that we are sending too many non-preferred reference laboratory tests to send to other labs when we could do it cheaper and faster and better at our own institution. So to remedy this problem, the lab department has initiated other ways to tackle this problem. So they have a new contract with Quest at a total savings of about $400,000. They've initiated, which you've probably seen yourselves, residents pop-up warnings for duplicate testing to signal that that same test result was already done and performed and resulted within 24 hours of your test order. And they have a lean process in place where they've hired a new children's national employee who actually will obtain prior authorization from the insurance company before sending genetic tests as an inpatient, who will make sure that that test is run in the proper reference lab so that we can save money. And she just started, so there's not a whole lot of savings that you can see, but it's actually $13,000 in our first week of work, which is pretty good. So some future steps. I'd like to prioritize education of faculty to be conversant in the terminology of overuse so that they are more likely to recognize it, to label it, and to discuss it. As faculty become more aware, so will our trainees. I'd also like to shift our dialogue to include more conversations about safely doing less. This is not simply therapeutic nihilism where we just do less to do less. I'm talking about safely doing less. We know that there's areas like in HIV where spending more and doing more is actually appropriate. But we could change our conversation such that instead of saying things like, well, we might as well draw that blood culture now because we're drawing blood anyway, instead we could reframe that for our trainees and discuss it like this. Well, we know that that blood culture costs X dollars, and the probability of having a positive blood culture in this diagnosis is so low that the risk of a false positive or a contaminate outweighs the benefit of doing that now. Or as a hospitalist, maybe we could say that instead of keeping the patient overnight for observation just to be safe, we could say, actually, this patient meets discharge criteria. To be safe, let's go ahead and take out that IV and send the patient home. Or maybe instead of saying things like all patients need follow-up with their primary care provider following hospitalization, we could identify what specific problems need to actually be addressed so that we can decrease office visits overall. I didn't show you the data, but there's over 700,000 cases of influenza-like illness that are acquired annually just from simple office visits. And I think all of our hospital follow-ups are contributing to that. And also there's probably a lot of TAMIFLU prescriptions that are resulting. I think we also need to build more benchmarks across all specialties so that we can assess how we're doing and then create a system that provides feedback by provider or by unit that lets us know how we're doing. I'd like a heat map for myself. I'd like to see, Stephanie, Todd, how am I doing in these areas that we're working on? And I think some of the Transformation 2018 diagnoses or process improvements are already areas that we can target to start developing some of these heat maps. As physicians, I think we tend to think that we're doing it well or that we're doing it right, but we really have no data to prove that to ourselves. And then I think we're already doing this at Children's National, at least within our hospitalist division, but incentivizing properly for the changing world of payer reimbursement, meaning incentivizing for adding value instead of just for volume is really the wave of the future. All right. In sum, overuse is pervasive. It's costing us billions of dollars and it's causing harm. We can do better, but you can also be part of the solution. Okay. There you are. Oh, Dr. Cheech stole the thunder. Next, okay.
Hi, Steph. Really fabulous. Congratulations taking on a very difficult issue and making it intelligible and motivating us all to think more. You know, one thing that I found a little bit missing from your presentation is, of course, the patient voice. You didn't really get to that. When you look at patients and they're thinking about overuse and tests and stuff, you know, in your environment, let's talk about bronchiolitis.
Sure.
Is there any evidence that patients are responding positively or negatively to fewer nebulized treatments, less viral testing, less pulse oximetry measurement? Do they see that as a good thing, a bad thing? How are they thinking about these issues?
I'm going to throw that back at you because I think our job is not exponentially, but slightly harder when they see things that are done in the emergency department. Okay. So it becomes a challenge to convince them that those things that were done are better or not necessary, okay? And the patient is often better from interventions that were done in the emergency department. I didn't talk about this data, but there is data that shows that suctioning or fever defervescence or just maybe tincture of time makes the patient better. But when you throw into the mix things like bronchodilators or continuous pulse oximetry or oxygen use for that temporary DSAT, I think parents don't really understand it's difficult. That information asymmetry between what a physician knows and what a family knows is very difficult to reconcile. So yeah, I do spend a lot of time with my patients, a lot of time actually, to the tune of probably over 15 minutes per encounter, talking about some of these interventions that we're doing as a hospital and why they're not necessary. But I find it difficult to convince them with data because I don't think they're driven by data. I think they're driven by what the kid looks like, and they say that their kid looks better now. So I use a lot of that as well, talking about, well, at this moment in time, your child is better, and this is the natural course of the illness or how it should progress, and that we've probably already peaked, and that actually there's harms associated with those interventions. When I talk about the harms, I think that resonates a little bit. I try and take them off the pulse oximeter really as quickly as possible because I feel like they rely on that monitor to show them that their child is doing better. And if I can get them off the monitor as early as I can in the hospital stay, then I think that they'll realize that their child is fine without it before discharge. So the patient perspective is important, but it includes that shared decision-making, which I briefly mentioned, but difficult to reconcile with that information asymmetry. Does that answer your question?
I think that you did a wonderful job, Stephanie, and I applaud you for tackling this at so many different levels because it is very complex but very important that not only we but everybody address this issue. I wanted to just make a statement about the national initiative called Choosing Wisely, which was started in 2011 by the American Board of Internal Medicine. It's actually 2012. And what they've done is they've tried to generate a national conversation by getting different specialty and general organizations to join and to work on developing lists of items that physicians and patients should question. And so there's 70 specialties that are involved, including the American Academy of Pediatrics. And in the first 3 years of this, the American Academy of Pediatrics developed a total of 15 items for all of pediatrics. It included some very good things like don't do brain imaging for for head trauma unless it's high risk. Don't do urine cultures for asymptomatic patients. But the field of pediatrics is really huge, and we should be able to come up with a lot more. And so I have volunteered recently to become the physician championship for the AAP Choosing Wisely initiative, and I'm working with each subspecialty group trying to get them to come up with their lists of 5. And it's going slowly, but at least in endocrinology we're moving ahead. So I'm hoping that more people hear this because I'm amazed. When I talked at Future of Pediatrics about this, we had a room of 200 people and hardly anybody had heard of Choosing Wisely. Can I see a show of hands of how many people in this room have heard of the Choosing Wisely initiative? Close to half, a little better. Okay, well, thank you very much. Oh.
I just want to echo the comments about the great topic and great presentation. So I have a question for you. My question is...
Please don't make me draw a diagram of the heart.
I will not.
Okay.
But I will put in a plug. If you consult cardiology and we don't think the echo is indicated, maybe we should say, hey, the echo is not indicated. That's not my question. My question for you is, when is the comment? When is the problem, I'm sorry, because you commented that education is a key piece. And like, to make an analogy, you can graph empathy from medical school through senior attendinghood. Okay. And empathy starts high, and then all due respect to the resident, it tends to plummet, I think, probably near the end of intern year, and then comes back up, and then we're all very empathetic providers. So I imagine that the medical students and the residents sitting on the other side of the room are thinking, I'm going to be really good at this, and I can tell you they are. I'm on service this week, and they're telling me, don't do that, that's not necessary, and they're usually right. So I think the residents are actually really quite good at this. But we know this is a problem, and how many times anybody who's doing consult is like, well, I'm calling this consult because they made me, even though I don't think I need it, or I'm getting this because they made me, right? So So when does this problem happen? You know what I'm saying? Like, I think the residents know I'm not going to get wasteful tests, but then there's those of us on service who are maybe doing it. And we know it's a problem, even if we don't think it's us. Yeah. So when do you think it happens, and when is the appropriate time to really focus that, you know, educational investment?
Yeah. Complicated answer. I have a few thoughts. First of all, I don't know. But from the outset, at the beginning, is really the best time, and then throughout the entire medical training, even through your faculty shifts, okay? We should be focusing on this issue. I think that training is a little bit difficult because it's difficult to have tacit knowledge transfer, meaning my experience level of seeing a condition 1,000 times over helps me identify an illness script or helps me identify ways to add value by minimizing testing because I recognize it. I know what to do. And for our trainees who are just beginning their education, they don't have that kind of wisdom. You know, that's not part of their natural sort of ability to treat at the beginning. But when they start to want to order those tests, that's the time that we can intervene and say, how is that helping us? So it's part of that changing of the dialogue of teaching. So instead of, you know, how will that test benefit my patient, which I think we tend to ask a lot, we can actually say, is there any harm associated with that? Okay, so to get them to sort of flip their thought process a smidge. I don't know the answer, but I think throughout education is key. Anybody else have more thoughts on that? Is it they want to add? Okay, well, we can go to Shankar.
Hi. I have a question concerning like gray areas in the guidelines. So, for instance, like bronchiolitis, the guidelines are pretty clear with who it applies to, and like one of the populations that it doesn't apply to that we see a lot are patients in their second episode. So, like what guidance do you have for that? And did they take those patients completely out of that study from earlier? Was that a population that was looked at all in terms of like following guidelines?
They take out patients with repeated episodes of wheezing from the new guideline recommendations?
From the study that Dr. Parikh did, did that include patients in their second episode of bronchiolitis?
So that was 2014. So I think you were pre.
Okay. So it's like long pre the guidelines. Okay.
Yeah. But yeah. Right. No, that was all the guidelines. I was going to mention that, but I think we're still overusing those medications, so I didn't highlight it. But yeah, we can reassess where we are post the new guidelines. Bronchiolitis is heterogeneous. It's not a single entity. Okay. So when we talk about bronchodilator use, it works about 10% of the time, and I don't think we know yet which patients it works on. That's why you see so much overuse, because we're afraid of doing too little. Okay. When in reality, I think tempering and waiting and having some patience should be how things are going to evolve. It may be appropriate. I mean, I did spend a good portion of my training in the emergency department, and I'm not suggesting that we for 8 hours until you have 60 people in the waiting room is appropriate, but I don't know that we always need to use that as much as we are. Yeah.
I really love the part about overuse, and I think, you know, my generation of physicians is really coming up in this age where we're really thinking about that, and I appreciate, you know, the part about that. I think my question lies in terms of medications and medication cost. I totally agree with, you know, using less and, you know, switching medications when we can, but it seems like that's a Band-Aid on the greater symptom of, you know, the greater problem that is big pharma. And I know you didn't really get to address this, but, you know, where are physicians mobilizing in order to tackle that issue?
Is that what
yeah.
Like,
I
don't know.
Yeah.
We can talk about that. That'd be great. We bring a microphone down to the front. No, go ahead. Go ahead, Jeff.
Stephanie.
Yeah.
Question. I think and a comment. I think some of the fundamentals is it originates from what's called the principle of moral hazard. That is, there is no downside risk of some action, and I think that's what drives the patient behavior. That as a parent, I want everything done for my child because there is no cost to me. I think the insurance industry, that's why adds deductibles and co-pays and stuff like that. I think when you look at how the United States, the payment system is versus in other parts of the world, resource poor, I think where the parents and the patients have to bear a part of the consequences of this testing, I think there's a little more rational usage, and the pressure is not there from the family and patient perspective. But I think the model hazard applies to physicians also. So I'm uncomfortable, so I want to transfer the patient to the ICU. I'm uncomfortable, so I will get that MRI, which is not really indicated. And all kinds of justifications are made, and there is nothing that nobody points it out to me that, you know, you wasted money last night. And I think so that whatever heat map, similarly, I think if there could be a process of either a scorecard or at a divisional level, and we see this all the time, bronchiolitis management, a particular physician who may be a senior physician may very opinionated and say that I don't care about the guidelines, and there is no consequences to that kind of behavior. I think that's what I think education will only go so far.
Yeah, well, I mean, we are stuck in dogmas, for sure, of things that we think work when in reality they don't, so we're slow to change. But,
this is the project that I want to work on next, and Mary Ottolini and I have already started to meet with some people. Jefferson is no longer with us through the Bear Institute, but that's a person that we had already started a process. We're actually trying to identify a way that we can give really pretty timely feedback to providers so that when I'm on service, for example, and let's pick bronchiolitis because that's the theme right now, we can look at that and say, you know, how much bronchodilator did I use this past week? And it includes my residents that I've been working with. And we can sit down and look at that and say, was that indicated or not, and talk about the costs associated with it. So I agree. Granular data transparency is really key to driving or to convincing us that we need to change. I think without that data, we think we're doing better than we are. And I think the whole conversation about those errors of omission versus the errors of commission, so participating in something unnecessarily simply because it feels better, it feels safer, is really pretty important to look at.
Well, Dr. Todd, thank you for your leadership and for your strong voice in this work. This is really, really important. A couple of things that are critical around this. I think that, you know, as we move from volume to value, it's not that it's not going to, or that it's going to stop at this point. It's going to continue on, and we're going to continue on this value train. So the more that we push the quality and reduce our costs, the better off we will be as an organization. So we can think about how we use those dollars to invest otherwise that would be wasted. And that's really, really important. You all hold the purse strings in ways you never thought you did before, and using evidence to, you know, the evidence that's out there to drive down the cost is critically, critically important. There was a question around Big Pharma, and it is outrageous. It makes us all outraged. So they, as you know, when the ACA was passed, Big Pharma was really, was relatively silent and quiet within that legislation. So I'm not for sure what will happen with this new administration, if any changes will be made, but certainly we all heard about the EpiPen situation over the summer, and that really got the attention of Congress, and we need to continue in that vein. Now, what are we doing internally? So Ursula Tachimenci, she has been leading that effort with CHA and working with CHA in terms of Ursula sitting right here in front, and so she's been pushing on the cost perspective there, and we have a lot going on from a CHA perspective so that our voice from a children's hospital perspective is heard, and also AHA has a lot going on too. But we need to do a lot more because it is completely outrageous in terms of what they're doing. But I commend the medical staff because there's been great, great practice change by just having that bit of information to make the change necessary. So the other point that I wanted to make, Dr. Shankar, is on the scorecards. Whether we like it or not, we're already being evaluated by our payers. So Denise can probably give you a list of all of our providers who are red based on Care First data that has come back to us on our utilization. And so the data is out there, the information is out there. So the faster that we can get, you know, working with the Bear Institute, get our own utilization scorecards up and running, the better. But Stephanie, congratulations and great grand rounds. Thank you.